Hello and welcome to the Cognate. My name is Zakir. A recent report published in the Hindu newspaper says that a three-member committee of the Indian Council of Historical Research, which reviewed the entries in the Dictionary of Martyrs of India's freedom struggle, is said to have sought the removal of the Moplah leaders of the Malabar rebellion, saying that the 1921 rebellion against the British was never part of the independence struggle, but a fundamentalist movement focused on religious conversion. The book was released in 2019 by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and this controversy comes close on the heels of a statement made by former BJP National General Secretary Ram Madhav, who said that the Moplah rebellion of 1921 was one of the first manifestations of the Taliban mindset in India. Now, little is known about the Moplah Uprising outside of Kerala, which is described by historians as the first nationalist uprising in southern India. So who were the Moplahs? What was the Moplah Uprising? What was the objectives behind it? And was the allegation posed by the BJP that the Moplah rebellion was anti-Hindu? What are the facts behind this? To answer this and more, we are joined by Khalid Noor Muhammad, who's a student of history and who has extensively written and researched on the subject. He's currently pursuing his master's program in the Department of History and Civilization in the International Islamic University of Malaysia, and soon will be joining a PhD program there. Khalid sir, welcome to the Cognate.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
My pleasure to be with you.
Same here, sir. Khalid sir, you've read about the controversy, but the controversy, it's not something recent. There's a lot of controversy and ambiguity on how the Moplah rebellion started and what was its objectives. Could you please describe us what led to this rebellion and how long did it last?
Well, actually, to go into details would involve a lot of time. What we should understand primarily is that the Moplah Uprising of 1921 was not the first. There were a large number of uprisings, but prior to the uprising of 1921, the rest were those aimed at what we will call the landed aristocracy of the Genoese, most of whom were upper caste Hindus. So they were protesting in those earlier uprisings against the atrocities meted out to them by the landed class, like depriving them of their lands or depriving them of their produce and not giving them a fair deal. And then the Moplahs would rise up against them, and they would go and even to the extent of murdering those people whom they considered to be the perpetrators of tyranny. But the one in 1921 is very different. Though a lot of Marxist scholars or historians club this uprising with the previous uprisings, this was very different. Because in 1921, if you will remember, that was the peak of the non-cooperation movement. Even leaders like Gandhi, Shaukat Ali, and other prominent North Indian leaders had come down to Calicut and Ottapalam and other parts of Malabar to win support for the cause of the non-cooperation movement and the Khilafat movement. Now, the non-cooperation movement is very well known. I don't need to expound on that. But the Khilafat movement, though known, is not too very well known. So the Khilafat movement was primarily started by Muslims in India to tell the British that if they don't hand out a fair deal to the Ottoman rulers, who were, in their nadir after having reached their zenith, then the Indian Muslims would protest. And they tried to lobby support to be able to get the Ottoman rulers a fair deal, especially after their defeat in the First World War between 1914 and 1919. I'm not going into the genesis of the Khilafat movement, though it started in 1911 in the name of Anjuman Khuddam-e-Kaaba, and the formal Khilafat movement started in 1919 after it was noticed that the Allied forces were treating the defeated Ottomans with great disdain and were humiliating them, much against their own promise of not wanting to dismember the Ottoman Khilafah and not take away from them the control of the two holy mosques, much against their initial promises. They went against that and they broke up the Ottoman Empire. And that's a long story. But this feeling that the Khalifa of the Muslimin was being humiliated was primarily the objective of the Khilafat movement, to let the Muslim masses know that they have to rise up and protest against the leader of the Allied forces, that was Britain. And they were under the suzerainty of Britain. And they felt, the Muslims in India felt that they were given a raw deal because the promise they made, which inspired the Muslim sepoys to join the British in their battles against the Central Powers. That includes Germany, Austria, etc., etc. So, but when Muslims noticed that the Khalifa was being humiliated, so they started a movement, and one of the places where it was most widely, shall I say, accepted was in the Malabar.
Okay.
The Moplahs are always known for their zeal for, and this, shall we say, belittling of their Khalifa with great concern, and they organize rallies along with the non-cooperation members. Incidentally, many of the members of the local regional Khilafat committees were non-Muslims. Keshava Menon and the others. As if I get time, I will show you some of the clips which detail these things. So when they rose up, the police tried to stop these rallies. And unlike other parts of India, the Moplahs, they resisted the police atrocities. They did not cow down. They did not just agree to be imprisoned and taken away. They ways and took to guerrilla methods of combating the police, who in turn invited the army. The then collector, one Mr. Thomas, and a police inspector, I can't get his name exactly now. Yeah. He was among the local Hindus. He invited the army to come in, and a martial law was enforced. But the Moplahs were not to be cowed down. They resisted, and this is what we will call as the Moplah Uprising. Now, what shape it took, what are the vicissitudes that it went through, that's a story that needs to be told. And I've tried to explain it in about 5 to 6 videos I've made on the subject.
Sure.
But let me hand it over to you again to ask your next question.
Sure. Once the rebellion started, the Moplahs also established a state within a state. And it is told that, the state was an Islamic state. There was Sharia, which was implemented, and it was done in open defiance of the British. So could you throw some more light as to how this came into being, from a rebellion to establishing a state, which I think lasted for almost 6 months? And how did this state, work, and how did it end? How did the Moplah rebellion come to an end?
See, the connotation of the word state, in our understanding, should not be applied fully to what they call the Khilafat Raj that Wariya Kun Muhammad Haji had established in the region we call the Arnard and the Walwanar regions. What he had done was he had kept the British and the British, I don't mean only the ethnic British people, but even those sepoys, Indian sepoys who worked for the British. The British brought in the Gurkhas, yes, and they brought in a tribe from Burma who are known for their forest warfare. I'm again forgetting the name of that particular time. They were like the Gurkhas, yeah, fierce warriors. So they did everything to break the siege that the Moplahs had put around those particular areas. So when they found that those areas are free from the British control, they established a governance of their own, where they had, like any local government, would ensure public utilities and law and order and things like that. And they even apparently had what is called a passport issued. But it may not necessarily resemble the passport that you and I carry today. Yeah. But it was primarily a way of establishing their authority in those areas.
True.
And of course, that was very much disliked, because in the entire imperial history of Britain, there was no community that had challenged them and established their own rule, despite having been subjects of Britain. And this was incomparable to any other force that was ruled by the British. I'm not going to compare about the Algerians who were ruled by the French, etc. But in British ruled territories, whether in the subcontinent or outside, no community had resisted the British rule or the British forces with that kind of tenacity and with that kind of vigor as the Moplahs had done. So talking about their state, it was in that sense that Warikunath Haji had established what is called the Khilafat Raj. Incidentally, as one historian will tell you, Hussain Randitani, the rules and regulations that he had formed were not based on the Quran and Sunnah, for that matter. They were based on generally accepted best practices in running a government. And many of the members of those Khilafat committees were also non-Muslims. So this flies in the face of those who try to allege or try to communicate the impression that they had established an Islamic state. It was a Khilafat Raj and not a Islamic state.
Islamic state, yeah, not particularly Islamic state governed by the rules of the Sharia. Were any of these, Moplah leaders, I mean, what were their backgrounds? Were they religious scholars or were they peasants? Could you throw some light on that? Because because there are a lot of allegations that these were.
You see, the bulk of the Moplahs. Sorry, I'm sorry to have cut you. Can you repeat your question?
That's absolutely fine. You can go ahead.
Okay, fine. The prominent names that we hear about, Ali Musliar and Warikunath Haji. Warikunath Haji was basically a bullock cart driver, if you would like to call it. But his father was exiled and he was exiled along with him for one of those earlier uprisings, which were not uprisings inspired by the Khilafat movement. So this is something to be kept in mind. So you could call them, the earlier ones, as peasant uprisings, but this was definitely not. It was purely inspired by the Khilafat movement. And in one of my interviews with KK and Kurup, is a non-Muslim historian of that region, he told me very clearly it was not a peasant uprising, despite having Marxist leanings, that they were primarily inspired by the Khilafat movement. And I have a recording of his audio as well. If I have time, I could play it for you. So as far as Ali Musliar is concerned, and some of the other people who have the name prefix attached to them called Tangal, these were all scholars. And the Tangals primarily were scholars who had come down from the Yemen, from the Ahl al-Bayt, the family of the Prophet ﷺ, and were there primarily teachers, preachers, jurists, etc. So Ali Musliar had gone to the Hijaz for his education. And he came back, he was a follower of Gandhi and the non-cooperation movement. There are sources who tell me he used to always wear the khadar, so the khadi cloth. And he was as much a Khilafatist as much as he was a Congress member of the non-cooperation movement. Because during those days, the non-cooperation movement and the Khilafat movement almost were like, hand in glove, or were working close to each other. I hope this answers that question.
Sure.
About the background of the Moplah leaders.
Absolutely.
One or two of them, Warikunath Haji. Okay, no, I think I've said what I had to say.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I also read in the article that you had shared with me was that many of the leaders of the Moplah rebellion were also Hindus. It was not just the Muslims who were in prominent positions, but there were a lot of Hindus as well. And they were imprisoned and probably executed. I'm not sure if they were executed, but there were a lot of upper caste Hindus who were also part of the rebellion. Could you throw some light on why were they part of such a rebellion, which primarily consisted of Muslims?
You must take this in its context. Yeah. Initially, there were a large number of non-Muslims who participated in what we call the Khilafat committees.
Yeah.
And they prodded the Moplahs to rise up against the British. So much so when Gandhi went and addressed a huge gathering in the beach of Calicut.
Yeah.
Or was it Ottapalam? I can't remember right now.
It's Calicut.
At that time, he actually invoked the pride of the Moplahs by telling them that, look, you must rise up and fight against the British. Saying that when they did rise up, it's a different turn altogether. Such was also the case with many of the Moplah many of the Hindu upper caste leaders who were part of the Khilafat movement. When they saw that the British were gaining the upper hand, and then many of their kind were being imprisoned. I mean, I actually have a couple of books here which I can share with you, but you've confined me with time, so I'm not going to stray away from the answers, and I'm trying to be as pointed as possible. So those people not only moved away from the Khilafat movement, they actually gave evidence against the Muslim Moplahs. This is exactly the same thing that happened during the 1857 mutiny, when a large number of Hindus, who were by and large in larger numbers involved against the mutiny against the British, they turned face, joined Britain, and would, for the sake of some financial gain, point out to Muslims as those who were involved, and they got a lot of Muslims during those days to hang on the gallows. So this was very much what happened. However, you cannot take it away from the fact, and this is told to me in person by none else than a prominent historian of the region, whom I have covered in one of my videos. His name was Mustafa Kemal. I think he was named after Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. I had met him once in '96 during one of my visits to Malabar, first visit to Malabar, along with a lot of other scholars. So he was teaching history in the Tirurangadi College. But later on now, when I met him in 2020 in Calicut in a seminar, he told me that if this was anti-Muslim, the movement, the Hindus would never have supported it.
True.
So this is an answer, but I cannot say that the Hindus stuck to the Khilafat movement when things turned sour.
Yeah, true. Which comes to our next question, that the primary allegation against the Moplah rebellion is that the leaders associated, or the people associated with the rebellion, were anti-Hindus. Many of them actually killed the Hindus, and thousands of people were forcefully converted to Islam. Is there any truth at all to any of these allegations? Because the official records say that over some 10,000 people were killed during this rebellion, excluding the 2,000 some rebels who were actually killed. So what does the facts say? What does history say about this?
So we should go to the primary sources for this.
Yeah.
If you're going to go to secondary sources, you're going to find a lot of wild imagination at work.
Yeah.
What are the primary sources we will refer to? One of the primary sources I have referred to is the book by Modi Kunnat Nambudar on what he would call Moplah reminiscences. It was first written in Malayalam in the 60s, and then later I think his grandson translated it. I have a copy with me over here. It was called the Moplah reminiscences. In that, he has written his first-hand experience. As a matter of fact, he was also jailed for a considerable period of time, tortured in the jail, and went through a great amount of hardship on the basis of his having been involved with the Khilafat movement in some form or the other. Of course, he got bailed out by advocates who belonged to his own community. He was a high caste Hindu. In this entire book, he never talks about large-scale atrocities or large-scale conversions. As a matter of fact, he's gone into great detail about other things that happened, to him personally in jail, and how he had to suffer the ignominy of having to drink from the hands of a non-Brahmin. And for him, that was a great humiliation compared to any other thing that he faced. He's gone into great details about all that, but he has never, ever pointed out to any incident where Hindus were attacked because they were Hindus, or or a large-scale conversion. He does refer to conversions having taken place, but he hasn't substantiated a single statement of his with any actual incident, name of the place, who were the ones who carried out these things. But the other primary source, I would say, which has been very well documented by Mr. Panikkar, a very famous historian. There are two of his books, Lord and State, and the other one is, incidentally, I returned it back to the library. And some of these things I can't recollect offhand, but nevertheless, I've covered it up in detail in my theses, as well as in the videos that I have said. So Panikkar, in one of his books, Peasant Movements in India, I guess, that's the name of the book. In that, he has documented from the source the arguments that took place in the Legislative Assembly, in the then British Legislative Assembly, and in the Central Legislative Assembly, which was, of course, not an elected body, but it did have representation from leading Indians, including Muslims, non-Muslims, etc. They were generally selected on basis of their education and their contributions to the British Raj, etc. So that makes for some very interesting reading, especially names like Mr. Shamnar and others, Ikramullah Khan and the others. They forcefully argued in front of the British Home Minister that all these allegations are false. And not only did they allege that, they said, okay, institute a commission of inquiry and clear up the scene. Why don't you institute a full-fledged independent inquiry committee to go into the details of whether really there were forced conversions, whether there were atrocities against Hindus because of them being Hindus. So the Home Minister, very politely refused it. He was completely what I had called equivocating on this subject. If they had instituted a commission of inquiry, then we wouldn't be discussing this subject. On the other hand, not having instituted this commission of inquiry itself leads to the conclusion that they had a lot of things to hide. And we must go back to the original reason why all these allegations started flying. Britain knew that if they had to rule over India, they had to make these two communities quarrel with each other, fight with each other. So every morning in the newspapers, you would read that so-and-so temple was demolished, so-and-so village was attacked, a Hindu village was attacked. So that would inflame the feeling of the local Hindus, and they would turn against the Muslims. Mm-hmm. Besides that, it was for whatever flaw in their character, they immediately became turncoats. When they saw the British army advancing into those areas, they would accompany the British soldiers into Moplah areas and identify people as being the perpetrators of the attacks against the British, not against the Hindus. And then the British forces would either arrest them or shoot them. So the Moplahs were incensed that their own co-workers have turned against them. So what they would do is that when nightfall happens, when the British army would retreat and the police would go back, they would come into those villages and attack the Hindus over there who became turncoats. So it is true that they attacked all those who supported the British against them. And that did not mean only Hindus. Even in certain villages where Moplahs worked as informers, they were rounded up and killed and thrown into wells.
Sure. I mean, this is something that we find in many, in these incidents in any kind of freedom struggle, that the people who are waging these kind of freedom struggle always see people who collaborate with the aggressor, with the colonialists as, a target. So we can see why, many of the Hindus and even Muslims were targeted by the Moplahs. As you have rightly pointed out, it had no religious reason. I mean, the religious identity was not the reason, but the fact that many of them were collaborating with the British was the primary reason why they were attacked and killed. I think we have covered, most of the points here. And one of the things that what I found is, once the rebellion started and once all these killings happened, there was a kind of silence that you see from the Congress Party itself, which had, like you said, along with the Khilafat movement, had prodded the Moplahs to join the Khilafat movement, the non-alignment movement. But after the downfall of the Moplah rebellion, you see that there is and of the massacre of many of the Moplah leaders. You see a silence from within the Congress party towards this. When you see when the Jallianwala Bagh killings happened in 1990, or the Chori Chora incident, the Congress came out and protested against these killings. But you do not see similar kind of protests from the Congress party. Was there any particular reason for this? In your research that you found out?
Actually, Brahmananda Namudripad, he brings it out in his book. He said that Gandhi should have protested against the killing of so many thousands of people in Malabar, which he did during the Chaura Chauri incident and during the Jallianwala Bagh incident. He himself expresses great surprise. As a matter of fact, he claims that if Gandhi had, like after the Chaura Chauri incident, had called off the non-cooperation movement, if Gandhi had called off the non-cooperation movement, when the Moplah Uprising start, I don't call it the Moplah Rebellion, because I believe that has different connotations. When the Moplah Uprising happened, it would have been better. But those reasons why the Congress took that stand and why Gandhi in particular took this stand, those answers are somewhat obvious, but somewhat ambiguous as well. And it'll be difficult for me to pass judgment on that. It's for the people to take their to decide why that when it came to the Moplahs, the treatment was different. As a matter of fact, you can go further into this and see that not only was the Moplah Uprising allowed to happen, the fact remains that after it happened, there were very terse and highly insinuating remarks made by Gandhi. A modern Moplah historian, Mr. T.A. Ansari, has pointed this out in his book. And if I had the time, I would have shown this to you, what exactly, because Gandhi went to the extent of saying the Moplahs were Muslims. Now, was that a piece of information or was that an insinuation?
Yeah.
So this is a big subject, and you bound me by the 30-minute thing. I've spent virtually a year and more.
I'll put the link to the documentaries and the videos that you've made so that people who are more interested, they can go back to your videos and go towards it. And lastly, sir, the question, we'll come back to the BJP. BJP, for the past 2 to 3 years, they've been raking up this issue again and again. The leaders in Kerala and even outside of Kerala have gone to the extent, like we just mentioned, of removing the names of the Moplah leaders from the Book of Martyrs. Essentially, what they're trying to do is delegitimizing and obliterating the struggle of Muslims for freedom and equality in the country. As a student of historian, as somebody who has done research, what do you think about what the BJP is doing, and why is it doing now, especially targeting Kerala? What is your take on this?
You see, the first thing to understand over here is what the BJP is right now doing is not very different from what the Arya Samajis did. After the outbreak of violence in Malabar in 1921-22, the Arya Samajis from Punjab and of course other parts of North India, they came all the way to Malabar, and they even, with I don't know what equipment they had those times, they even filmed whatever they could film with their those what we will call primitive equipment, and they went back and they made stories about what we will presently call as false stories about the Moplahs and the so-called persecution. And they did that to raise funds to be able to, what they would call, to do the Shuddhi of those people who had converted to Islam. But this is not something new. And we had asked S.G.S. Narayanan about this. So his answer is very succinct. And I would like you to, allow me to play his clip if there is time, or you could play that clip yourself later. So he clearly says that they were not reporting history. They were promoting politics. So what happened in 1921 is just another repetition here, because the mindset is the same. The mindset is one in which you need to demonize the Muslims to be able to garner support from the public. And this wanting to remove the names of Muslims from the list of martyrs is not something new. Even earlier, if you remember the wagon tragedy that took place in Tirur, I happened to, in 1996, give a lecture over there when I was very young, of course, accompanied with Qazi Mujahidul Islam, Khalilur Rahman Sajjad, Mufti Ashraf Ali, and all of them. And the same Mr. Kamal Pasha was translating my talk from English to Malayalam. And then when he made a mistake in the translation, I had to correct him because of a little knowledge of Malayalam I had. So the Tirur wagon tragedy hall, they have removed the names of people from there, and they are trying to prove that the wagon tragedy was not against the Muslims, was not against the Moplahs. They've already done that because that was under central government rule. The state government, despite being a leftist government, has done little except making a little noise here and there. Somehow it brings us back to the point that is only the BJP involved in demonizing Muslims, or are they getting tacit support from other parties? Whatever the names of the parties are, whatever the leanings of those parties are, they are getting away with all this because there are in those other parties people who agree with this kind of philosophy. But let me conclude by saying it is, as pointed out by T.A. Ansari himself in his wonderful book published by Routledge. I have it in my right, and I know it's going to take time for me to dig it out and show it to you. So he claims that the Moplahs did not write their own history. And he gives reasons for that. But whatever the reasons, I believe that if you do not put forth your narrative, the narrative of the adversary will get the upper hand. The adversary will gain an upper hand over you. As we see today, if you go and search even YouTube for videos made by Muslims against the allegations of the, shall we call it, the right wing, because Ram Madhav is not necessarily a BJP member. He is an RSS functionary. So it's not just that he is a member of a political party. He's an ideologue of a fascist party. So you need to highlight that aspect of this man. So this happens because, and they get away with this narrative because you don't have an alternative narrative. And I'm sad to say that despite having put in enormous amount of effort, even during the time when there was this lockdown, I had research assistants meeting up with historians and interviewing them. And when you go down and look at the number of people who even viewed your efforts, your clips, you'll find them in a meager 100 or 200 or 300. So that's pathetic. One is that we do not promote our case. We do not put forth our narrative on empirical grounds, not emotional grounds. And when somebody does it, the others are not interested even in watching it and forwarding it and, taking it further or adding on to it. So the BJP's interests in trying to demonize Muslims is very clear. You need an enemy. So you need to have some things to convince your constituents, your constituency that, look, these are your enemies. They did this to your folk. And look, and these are people whom you should decry and keep under your own control. So the BJP's award policy is that. What happens to the Muslims? Why don't they stand up and put forth their own narrative? And thanks to Cognate, at least that one newspaper report woke some people up. And I noticed that a lot of people are now sharing my video.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for the opportunity.
I think we have dispelled a lot of myths that's surrounding and the allegations. You've been, alhamdulillah, able to answer those things. And we'll put up the clips that you were talking about on the video itself so that people can benefit from that. Yeah. And I'll also, put up the link to the documentaries that you've made on the subject so that people can benefit from that as well. So thank you so much, Khalid sir, and thank you viewers for watching The Cognate. Please do check out Khalid sir's website as well. I'll put up the link in the description, and stay in touch with us for more such stories on Muslim issues. Thank you so much. Jazakallah khair.
Thank you very much. I hope